Power is often measured by reach, budgets, and alliances. Yet some outcomes remain stubbornly unchanged. In the relationship between Washington and Moscow, pressure accumulates, expectations rise, and still the result refuses to move. The reason isn't hidden strength, it's structural limits that rarely get examined. This is why the question isn't whether the United States applies influence, but why it still cannot convert that influence into control. The phrase, "no control," reflects a reality shaped by geography, institutions, deterrence, and strategy. The common narrative simplifies a relationship that is far more constrained than it appears. We'll break this down carefully, one reason at a time, moving from the obvious to the uncomfortable. The final reason reframes how power between these two states is usually understood, and why expectations of control persist despite repeated failure. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. The first limit is physical, and it exists before politics, ideology, or leadership choices enter the picture. Russia's geography has always imposed constraints on any external power seeking leverage. Its landmass is vast, its borders extend across multiple regions, and its strategic depth absorbs pressure rather than concentrates it. Distance alone slows reaction, enforcement, and escalation. Historically, this geography has shaped Russian security thinking. Repeated invasions from the West did not merely leave scars, they produced doctrine. Space became defense. Control from outside required more than influence. It required sustained presence across terrain that resists occupation, monitoring, and rapid response. Even in modern conditions, geography limits precision. Pressure applied at one point diffuses long before it reaches decision-making centers. For the United States, this creates an immediate constraint. Economic tools travel unevenly across regions. Military pressure cannot be applied directly without unacceptable risk. Diplomatic signaling loses clarity as it moves across layers of distance, intermediaries, and local conditions. Geography does not make Russia dominant, but it does make control inefficient. This matters because it sets the foundation for everything that follows. When control is geographically diluted, every subsequent tool must work harder to compensate, and usually fails to do so. But geography alone did not seal this outcome. Another barrier made direct pressure effectively unusable. Nuclear weapons impose a hard boundary that no amount of conventional power can cross. Between the United States and Russia, this boundary is absolute. Deterrence does not need to be invoked openly to be effective. It shapes every decision in the background. Control requires the credible threat of escalation. Nuclear parity removes that credibility. The logic is not new. During the Cold War, both sides learned that overwhelming capability did not translate into usable force. Mutual vulnerability created restraint. That structure never disappeared. It carried forward, shaping post-Cold War expectations while quietly limiting available options. The tools changed. The ceiling did not. For the United States, this means coercion has strict limits. Military superiority exists on paper, but its application stops well short of compulsion. The risk of uncontrolled escalation forces caution. Even indirect confrontation must be calibrated, signaled, and constrained. Control becomes a theoretical concept rather than an operational one. This alters the balance of influence. Russia does not need to match American power symmetrically. It only needs to ensure that escalation remains costly and unpredictable. Deterrence shifts the contest away from force and into endurance. Who can sustain pressure without crossing lines that cannot be uncrossed? The result is a stalemate disguised as competition. Actions are taken, responses follow, but neither side can force a decisive outcome. Control is replaced by containment, signaling, and denial. The United States can shape the environment, but it cannot command it. This is a critical failure point because it turns strength into restraint. The more powerful the tool, the less usable it becomes. And once force was removed from the equation, the struggle moved into a system that quietly favored resistance. Once direct force was constrained, pressure shifted into institutions. International bodies designed to regulate behavior, enforce norms, and legitimize action. On paper, this appeared to favor the United States. In practice, it introduced a different limitation. Russia was not outside the global system. It was embedded deep within it. The most visible example is institutional veto power. Within the post-World War II order, Russia inherited permanent authority that allows it to block outcomes it considers unacceptable. This was not an accident or a loophole. It was a deliberate design choice made to prevent major power conflict. Over time, that same design has limited the ability of any single power to impose control. For Washington, this creates a structural dilemma. Diplomatic pressure often relies on multilateral endorsement. Sanctions, resolutions, and enforcement mechanisms derive legitimacy from international consensus. Yet consensus becomes unattainable when one of the principal actors has the authority and incentive to block it. The result is not paralysis, but dilution. Measures are weakened, delayed, or fragmented before they are applied. This matters because institutional power operates quietly. It does not appear as defiance or confrontation. It appears as procedure, delay, and legal constraint. Russia does not need to challenge the system openly. It can simply use it as designed. Each blocked resolution narrows the range of acceptable responses and shifts action away from formal channels. Over time, this erodes leverage. Actions taken outside institutions lose legitimacy. Actions taken within them lose effectiveness. The United States is left managing optics rather than outcomes, demonstrating opposition without enforcing compliance. This is where expectations begin to break down. Control assumes the system will amplify pressure. Instead, the system absorbs it. What was meant to prevent escalation now prevents enforcement, locking the conflict into a prolonged stalemate. But institutional resistance only worked because something deeper shaped how pressure itself was interpreted. Pressure does not operate in a vacuum. How it is received matters as much as how it is applied. In the case of Russia, external pressure is filtered through a strategic culture shaped by repeated confrontation, insecurity, and survival. This culture does not interpret pressure as negotiation. It interprets it as threat. Historically, Russian state behavior has been shaped by vulnerability rather than expansion alone. Repeated invasions across open land routes produced a lasting belief that security depends on buffers, autonomy, and control over strategic space. Over time, this belief hardened into doctrine. External influence was not seen as temporary or conditional, but as the beginning of erosion. For the United States, this creates a fundamental mismatch. Tools designed to encourage adjustment, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, conditional engagement, are often read in Moscow as confirmation of hostile intent. Rather than encouraging moderation, they reinforce defensive consolidation. The signal sent is not flexibility, but pressure without an endpoint. This matters because strategic culture shapes political feasibility. Leaders operate within narratives their systems can sustain. In Russia's case, conceding under pressure carries internal risk. Compliance can be framed domestically as vulnerability or loss of sovereignty. Resistance, by contrast, aligns with historical expectation. It is easier to justify, even when costly. As a result, American leverage weakens at the moment it is applied. Each escalation narrows the space for compromise. External pressure strengthens internal cohesion, not fragmentation. Control mechanisms fail not because they lack force, but because they collide with a worldview that treats yielding as strategic failure. This does not make resistance unlimited. Costs accumulate, constraints bite, but the direction remains stable. Pressure changes conditions without changing trajectory. The system absorbs the impact and adjusts around it. At this point, control becomes structurally improbable. Influence exists, but only at the margins. And yet, even this resistance would have been harder to sustain without another form of insulation quietly limiting leverage. Economic pressure is often treated as the most flexible instrument of modern power. Unlike military force, it can be applied continuously, adjusted incrementally, and justified publicly. But its effectiveness depends on dependency. In the case of Russia, that dependency has always been partial, and in critical areas, absent. Russia's position as a major energy producer changes the balance fundamentally. Control over oil, gas, and other raw materials provides not just revenue, but but strategic insulation. Energy is not easily replaced, rerouted, or substituted at scale without long-term cost. This gives the supplier time to adapt, renegotiate, and absorb pressure that would otherwise be destabilizing. For the United States, this creates an uneven leverage environment. Financial restrictions can slow growth and limit access to capital, but they do not remove the core revenue streams that sustain the state. Energy exports continue to generate income, even under constrained conditions, and they anchor relationships that are resistant to external interference. Historically, this autonomy has altered outcomes. Economic pressure works best when it produces rapid internal strain. In Russia's case, strain accumulates slowly and unevenly. The effects are real, but they do not converge quickly enough to force political reversal. Instead, they encourage adjustment, new trade routes, alternative payment mechanisms, and long-term diversification away from vulnerable channels. This matters because economic control relies on predictability. Policymakers expect pressure to produce measurable behavioral change within a defined window. Energy autonomy disrupts that timeline. It stretches cause and effect so far apart that control loses urgency and clarity. Pressure becomes permanent rather than decisive. Over time, this changes expectations on both sides. The United States applies constraints knowing they will not compel immediate outcomes. Russia absorbs them knowing survival does not depend on reversal. What remains is endurance, not compliance. Economic leverage still matters. It narrows options and raises costs, but it no longer dictates direction. And as economic pressure settled into permanence, another assumption quietly collapsed, one that mistook cost for control. Sanctions are often described as instruments of compulsion, but historically they function more reliably as instruments of constraint. They limit access, raise costs, and complicate coordination. What they rarely do, especially against large, adaptive states, is produce political control. In the case of Russia, this distinction became increasingly clear over time. The initial assumption behind sanctions pressure was linearity. Restrict resources, generate internal strain, force policy adjustment. In practice, the response followed a different path. Rather than collapse or reversal, the system adapted. Domestic substitution expanded. Trade patterns shifted. Financial exposure was reduced where possible. The economy did not become immune, but it became less dependent on the channels being targeted. This matters because sanctions operate on time. Their effectiveness depends on creating urgency inside the targeted system. In Russia's case, urgency was diluted by scale, centralization, and strategic prioritization. Costs were absorbed unevenly, and political decision-making remained insulated from immediate public pressure. Economic pain existed, but it did not translate into leverage over core strategic choices. For the United States, this created a narrowing set of outcomes. Sanctions could demonstrate resolve and impose limits, but they could not compel compliance. Over time, each additional measure produced diminishing returns. New restrictions reinforced existing constraints rather than opening new leverage points. Pressure became cumulative without becoming decisive. Historically, this pattern has appeared elsewhere, but Russia's position amplified it. A large internal market, state capacity to redirect resources, and willingness to prioritize strategic goals over economic efficiency all reduced the impact of external pressure. Sanctions altered conditions, but they did not alter direction. This is where expectations quietly adjusted. Control was replaced by management. Policymakers shifted from anticipating change to sustaining pressure indefinitely. Sanctions became a holding action rather than a solution. That shift matters because it signals acceptance of limits. When pressure is applied without expectation of compliance, control has already failed, even if the measures continue. But sanctions only lost their force because another structure absorbed pressure even more effectively, one built into how power itself is organized. External pressure is most effective when it can fracture decision-making. It works by creating competing interests, internal veto points, and political costs that force reconsideration. In Russia's case, this mechanism consistently fails, not because pressure is weak, but because it has nowhere to land. Power within the Russian system is highly centralized. Strategic decisions are insulated from short-term economic and diplomatic shocks by design. Authority does not diffuse easily through competing institutions or electoral cycles. Instead, it concentrates within a narrow decision-making core that prioritizes regime continuity and strategic autonomy over responsiveness to external signals. Historically, this structure has proven resilient under stress. Economic strain, diplomatic isolation, and international criticism have not translated into policy reversal, because the system is built to endure pressure rather than respond to it. External costs are filtered downward, while strategic direction remains protected at the top. For the United States, this sharply limits leverage. Tools such as sanctions and diplomatic isolation assume that internal pressure will rise vertically, moving from economic disruption to political consequence. In a centralized system, that transmission weakens. Pain is real, but it is managed. Dissent is contained. Decision-makers remain buffered from immediate fallout. This matters because control depends on responsiveness. When leaders are structurally shielded from external consequences, influence loses its forcing function. Pressure does not fracture the system, it reinforces it. Centralization turns external threats into internal justification, allowing authority to consolidate rather than erode. Over time, this dynamic becomes self-reinforcing. Each round of pressure validates the narrative of external hostility. Each response strengthens internal alignment. The space for adjustment narrows not because options disappear, but because deviation becomes politically risky inside the system. At this stage, control is no longer obstructed by tools or timing. It is obstructed by structure. Influence remains possible, but only at the margins, and never at the center where decisions are made. And even this insulation would have cracked without something else quietly sustaining it over time. Control in modern conflict often relies on denial, cutting access to capabilities that cannot be easily replaced. In Russia's case, this strategy encounters a built-in obstacle: long-standing military self-sufficiency. The ability to sustain core defense functions without reliance on external suppliers sharply limits leverage. Historically, Russia invested heavily in domestic arms production, not for efficiency, but for autonomy. This priority intensified during periods of isolation, embedding redundancy and internal capacity into the defense sector. The result is not technological superiority across all domains, but continuity. Critical systems can be produced, maintained, and adapted without external approval. For the United States, this reduces the effectiveness of restrictions aimed at degrading military capability. Export controls and supply chain disruptions impose friction, but they do not paralyze. Production slows. Modernization becomes uneven, yet core operational capacity remains intact. The system bends without breaking. This matters because military pressure often operates indirectly. Even when force cannot be used, the threat of capability erosion can shape behavior. In Russia's case, that threat is limited. Self-sufficiency absorbs denial strategies and turns them into long-term constraints rather than immediate leverage. The impact becomes gradual, not decisive. Over time, this changes strategic calculations. External actors expect capability gaps to widen quickly. Instead, adaptation fills them imperfectly but persistently. Domestic innovation compensates for lost access. Older systems are extended. Priorities shift toward endurance rather than optimization. This reinforces a broader pattern. When a state can sustain its defense posture independently, pressure loses urgency. Control depends on dependence. Without it, leverage becomes probabilistic rather than coercive. The United States can influence the pace and cost of military development, but not its existence. By this stage, multiple tools have failed to converge. Geography, deterrence, institutions, culture, economics, and structure all limit control. Yet one factor remains that further dilutes pressure, not internally but globally. Because once alternatives exist beyond the Western system, pressure no longer comes from a single direction. Pressure is most effective when it is unified. When alternatives are limited, leverage concentrates. but the international system no longer operates that way. Over time, global power has shifted away from a single center, creating space for states to maneuver rather than comply. Russia has used this shift not to escape pressure entirely, but to diffuse it. Historically, U.S. influence was amplified by alignment. Political, financial, and security systems reinforced one another, narrowing options for those on the outside. As alternative centers of power expanded, that reinforcement weakened. Economic partnerships, diplomatic coordination, and strategic cooperation outside Western frameworks became viable, not equivalent but sufficient. For Russia, this matters because pressure no longer arrives from a single channel. Trade can be redirected. Financial mechanisms can be substituted. Political support can be partial rather than absolute. None of these alternatives removes cost, but together they prevent isolation from becoming decisive. This creates a strategic environment where pressure is absorbed horizontally rather than vertically. Instead of moving upward toward political reversal, constraints spread outward across networks. Each relationship reduces dependence on any single system. Control becomes conditional on cooperation that no longer exists. For the United States, this complicates enforcement. Unilateral measures lose reach. Multilateral measures require consensus that is increasingly difficult to sustain. Even coordinated pressure produces uneven effects as states prioritize their own interests. The system fragments under strain. This fragmentation does not mean influence disappears. It means it competes. Pressure becomes one factor among many rather than the defining one. Russia does not need full alignment to sustain itself, only enough external space to avoid collapse. At this point, control fails not because of resistance alone, but because the structure of the global system no longer supports it. Power is distributed, options exist, leverage is diluted by design, and yet all of these failures point toward a deeper misunderstanding, one that sits beneath every assumption made so far. Section 10, reason number 10. Control is not how modern power operates at the deepest level. The failure to control Russia is not the result of miscalculation, weak execution, or insufficient pressure. It is the result of a flawed expectation. Control, as a concept, no longer applies to relationships between sovereign, nuclear-armed states operating inside a fragmented global system. Modern power does not function through command. It functions through constraint, denial, and influence, none of which guarantee outcomes. The post-Cold War assumption that dominance could replace deterrence underestimated how much the system itself had changed. Institutions, markets, alliances, and military balance no longer converge toward a single center of authority. In this environment, the United States retains enormous influence. It shapes norms, sets standards, and mobilizes coalitions. But influence is not control. It cannot force alignment where structural incentives push in the opposite direction. Russia's behavior is not evidence of immunity to pressure. It is evidence that pressure does not operate the way it once did. Historically, control emerged when one power could dictate access to security, trade, legitimacy, or survival itself. That condition no longer exists. Russia possesses deterrence, autonomy, alternatives, and institutional standing sufficient to prevent coercion from becoming command. The system allows resistance without collapse. This is the uncomfortable conclusion. Not that the United States is weak and not that Russia is dominant, but that expectations were misaligned with reality. Pressure was applied as if the old rules still governed outcomes. They do not. What remains is a prolonged condition of constraint rather than resolution. Influence without control. Competition without decision. A relationship defined not by victory or defeat, but by limits that neither side can remove. This is not a temporary failure. It is a structural one. And once seen clearly, it changes how power, conflict, and outcomes must be understood going forward.